So good morning everyone. I'm going to start my presentation by just describing the principal legal framework for countering terrorist financing in South Asia. I won't dwell on this too much. I could spend hours and hours and hours lecturing on this, so I'm going to be quite descriptive and brief on this, but give you some of the main pertinent points and some of the problems and challenges with the legal framework. And then I'm going to move on to draw on some of my personal insight, collaborating with the UN and looking at the UN's roles and mechanisms, what the UN does in countering terrorist financing in South Asia. And lastly, I'm going to finish off by just highlighting some of the challenges, some of the things we need to think about in going forward, some of the stumbling blocks that I've come across, and where I think we need to go in the future. So if we start with the legal framework for tackling terrorist financing in the region of South Asia. As many of you will know, we've got the 1999 International Convention for the Suppression of the Financing of Terrorism. It's a groundbreaking convention in the sense it's the first counter-terrorism treaty that focuses on terrorist financing. And for that it's to be well respected. But the convention itself does have a number of problems. The first being it doesn't give us a clear definition of what terrorism actually is. Instead, it simply delegates the issue, really reflecting differences, entrenched differences among states. It delegates the issue to simply describing acts of terrorism as a number of counter-terrorism treaties annexed to that treaty. So it's kind of circular. It doesn't give any definition of terrorism. The other problem is in Article 2 of the Convention, it talks about the use of violence in times of armed conflict against persons not taking active part in hostilities. And for anyone from an international humanitarian law background or law of war background, it's well known that concept of taking active part in hostilities is quite vague. There's no clear definition on that legally. So it's quite unclear of what terrorism is, and also in terms of armed conflict, what is an active part in hostilities. And lastly, I think this is the most problematic of all. There's currently, across all UN member states, there's a huge disagreement on who would be exempt from not just this convention, but all counter-terrorism treaties. This one in particular is important in this context because a number of states say, well, we want an exemption clause in the treaty because for some groups, for some individuals, we don't consider them to be terrorists if they are fighting and using violence for a particular cause, especially if they're fighting colonialism, foreign aggression, foreign intervention, what's perceived to be foreign invasions, so they provide an exemption. Now, from my own experience working in Southeast Asia with the UN, I know a lot of countries in this region have such exemption clauses. They interpret this convention when applying it in their national legislation and when it's applied in practice by applying this exemption to certain groups of individuals. So for those states concerned, the relevant target group is simply not terrorist and therefore doesn't fall within the ambit of this legal convention. So the point I would make about this convention is it's groundbreaking in the sense it does provide us with the first financing convention related to terrorism, but it gives states a lot of leeway in terms of how it's applied and who's exempt from it and who's included. And really that goes to the heart of the convention because, as I said, under the convention states have an obligation to bring to justice those who collect funds, those who finance terrorism. And states simply aren't going to do that. They're not going to cooperate with each other in that process. If they simply say, well, that particular group is exempt from that legal definition under their interpretation of the convention. We also have Security Council Resolution 1373. This was adopted by the Security Council under its Chapter 7 powers, so it's legally binding on all states. And again, it requires states to prevent financing and provision of funds to terrorist groups. It also requires states to bring to justice anyone who provides funds to terrorists or for acts of terrorism. And again, that resolution is symptomatic of this broader problem that we have amongst UN member states, and that is there's no agreement of what a terrorist is, what a terrorist act is, what an act of terrorism is. So all those key legal concepts are just simply left undefined. So it gives states a lot of leeway in terms of how they interpret that resolution and how they implement it in their national laws, in their practice. We have Resolution 2178 in response to foreign terrorist fighters and that phenomenon there. And this resolution requires states to prevent financing to stop people from travelling overseas to engage in armed conflicts and to commit acts of terrorism overseas. So that's quite a unique resolution, but again, and it's legally binding on all states adopting the Chapter 7, but again, we have no definition of what terrorism is, what a terrorist act is. So again, it's hugely problematic. Now, all three of those legal regimes are monitored by the Security Council, and their implementation is monitored by the Security Council. And this is done by the Counter-Terrorism Committee and its Executive Directorate. Now, to date, more than 100 state visits have been undertaken by the Counter-Terrorism Executive Directorate, and national reports have been written up. Some of you may know that historically, back in 2001 to 2006, these reports were published and available online for us all to see, for us to analyse, for us to look at the data. And then the Security Council said, we're going to stop publishing these now, so now they're not publicly available. So the only way to access these reports is to do research directly in the concerned state, or perhaps work with the UN and get access to data that way. But it's a very difficult situation. So that's something that, going forward, I think we need to have a little bit more transparency in this reporting exercise, so we can actually analyse the data, how states are implementing these legal regimes in terms of making recommendations and going forward. Next slide, please. So, looking at the UN's role and mechanisms for addressing terrorist financing in South Asia, the first example I want to give you is my own experience, really, as what the UN calls an international expert. So, on several occasions, I'm asked to collaborate with the UN. Usually when cited, the Counter-Terrorism Committee's Executive Director has been on a country visit, the report will then be sent to me and I will look at it, and then I'll work with the government in question, I'll work with the UN, I'll make recommendations on legislative reform, how the counter-terrorism legislation needs to be changed somewhat, maybe it'll need updating, maybe it'll need to be broadened, or maybe it might be narrowed and made more focused and specific. I'll look at things like international cooperation and mutual legal assistance, really developing capacity of that particular state to respond to this problem more effectively. Some of the common things that I come across in my work, including in South Asia, are legislation sometimes is too broad in defining terrorism to the point where it becomes not workable as a legal concept. It becomes overly broad, and in turn, that law, that legal definition can be simply abused and used incorrectly. And you can get all sorts of groups and individuals being caught under the umbrella of terrorism. One of the other problems that I typically come across is sometimes legislation may be outdated. It may not actually criminalise terrorist financing effectively. It may not capture all the different means and ways that terrorists and terrorist groups finance themselves. So it may be too narrow from that sense. And the other problem I typically come across is the international cooperation and mutual legal assistance aspect. A lot of states don't have the infrastructure or the legal ability to cooperate effectively with partners, not just in the region of South Asia, but also internationally as well. So this is a bit of a problem too. The last thing I would say on this, I don't want to delve into any particular states. It wouldn't be fair to name any particular states. But one thing I would say is states do not always take on board these recommendations. And part of the problem is, because these reports are not publicly available, it's very hard then to get those states to comply. So, for example, sometimes the EU, for example, has intervened and suggested, well, it will withhold trade deals if the state doesn't comply. Or the Human Rights Council will say, well, we're going to publish a report and it's going to be publicly available. So, but beyond that, there's not a lot to get a state to comply. The other insight I want to bring to this, from the UN perspective, in 2017 I was asked to lead the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, the first ever project on the links between terrorism and crime, in particular organised crime. And a particular aspect of that, of interest for today, is how terrorist groups finance themselves through crime and criminality. And we looked at various regions of the world, and we did focus on South Asia in particular, and we found some quite interesting results from this. So we found that terrorist groups And terrorists engage in organised crime directly themselves, but they also work with organised crime groups and criminal groups, sometimes short-term, sometimes more medium to long-term. They have alliances, short-term, long-term. And the types of criminality that were engaged include things like drug trafficking, arms trafficking, kidnapping, trafficking in persons, including for sexual slavery, various types of criminality. And this wasn't confined to South Asia, I should say. The links with groups in South Asia traversed that region internationally. Now, unfortunately, this report went to the UN, it went to the Security Council for discussion and observation, but it wasn't published, and that's because I think it included sensitive data that could have perhaps implicated certain states in terms of were they tolerating or hosting certain groups on their territories? Were they doing enough to prevent this? So the report wasn't published, but if we just go to the next slide, please. And the slide after that. And one more. I'm going to fast forward a little bit. What we do find is the Security Council, since 2019, has published a flurry of resolutions based on this report. And if you look at these resolutions, and I haven't got time to go into these, but if you just take a look at the resolutions, it notes in the preambles of the resolutions this link between terrorism and organised crime. All the points that we found in our report. It doesn't reference our report for obvious reasons, because it doesn't want to pick on any particular region or state. This is very general observation. But the resolutions themselves say more is needed now. So suddenly the Security Council has woken up to this very important issue. More is needed, more research is needed. States need to undertake what it calls terrorist financing investigations. One of our findings, for example, found that states very rarely undertake terrorism investigations, and even rarer, terrorist financing investigations. Usually the state in question will just treat the issue as a type of crime, low-level criminality, forgetting about the context and the broader picture. So the Security Council now agrees that this is something that needs to be pushed forward. So I'm going to just go to the next slide and finish with challenges, because I'm cautious of time. If we just think about the challenges in going forward now, terrorist groups are present in member states in South Asia. They've been gaining a strong foothold since at least 2015, from my own insights working with the UN. And this is something that's growing in severity. The Financial Action Task Force has also designated high-risk jurisdictions in South Asia, such as Pakistan, Sri Lanka. So we know there's a real problem with terrorism, terrorist financing in the region. As I said already, member states don't always implement the counter-terrorism treaties and Security Council resolutions effectively in their domestic law. And my recommendations and collaborating with the UN are always not implemented either. We need clearer definitions of terrorism, terrorist financing in South Asia, so states in that region can work more effectively together. And I think we do need more investigation, so more capacity building, so states have the ability to undertake terrorism investigations and terrorist financing investigations. So we need prosecutors, law enforcement, border agencies, this kind of thing, to be trained on this, how to undertake such endeavours. And if we just go to the final slide, please. The other thing I wanted to just say in terms of the challenges is the relationship between the state and local communities. We do see in South Asia, including in this picture, the state doesn't always have a good relationship with local communities. Policing is not effective, and therefore intelligence is not effective. And often those counter-terrorism powers that a state has are misused, and therefore it distances other communities. And lastly, my last point is, my plea really is for more evidence-based research on how terrorist groups in South Asia fund themselves and get financing. It needs to be evidence-based, but we need states to participate in bringing forward information and collaborating with research analysts to get a better picture of this. So thank you.
Thank you.